The Food of the Gods wasn't just a film about nature mutating, it was a set where nature pushed back. Cameras jammed, miniatures buckled, insects invaded scenes, and the crew worked under the creeping sense that the island wasn't merely a location, but an unpredictable character. Every attempt to control the environment only exposed how fragile their production really was. Shadows shifted strangely, animals reacted to things no one could see, and the footage seemed to carry a life of its own. Why did this modest 1,976 film feel like it was documenting a world slipping out of alignment? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about The Food of the Gods. Fact 1. The production's earliest shock came the moment the crew realized that the rats intended to be the film's core threat weren't just unpredictable performers. They were a force of nature that simply refused to be choreographed. The plan seemed straightforward in pre-production. Build intricate miniature farm structures, place the animals inside them, and use forced perspective to transform them into towering predators. But once the cameras rolled, that plan unraveled spectacularly. The rats were curious, bold, and far too intelligent to remain where the crew needed them. They chewed through tiny doors, climbed flimsy roofs, and darted into sections of the set where perspective distortions destroyed the scale illusion. Wranglers tried guiding them with food incentives, but the animals quickly learned that food meant traps or human interference. They developed their own unpredictable routes, weaving through the miniatures in ways that made continuity nearly impossible. Some slipped between lighting stands, others vanished behind equipment, forcing crew members to spend long stretches searching through brush, crates, and even costume racks. Any rat positioned precisely for a take would inevitably move seconds before action, and the forced perspective setup offered no flexibility for improvisation. Meanwhile, the camera team struggled to keep the frame stable. A single bump from a rat brushing the tripod leg could ruin the illusion and contaminate an entire sequence. Resetting became a punishing cycle. Reposition the animals, repair damaged miniatures, recalibrate the frame, and hope the rats cooperated long enough for a usable take. Yet, there was an unplanned brilliance in their defiance. Their restless movements gave the rats a natural menace that no trained action could imitate. The creatures didn't seem like props or controlled performers. They seemed alive, intent, and strangely aware. The film's unsettling energy emerged directly from that chaos. Instead of acting, the rats simply existed on their own terms, and the camera captured a raw unpredictability that made the threat feel genuine. Fact 2. The infamous giant chicken sequence owed its surreal power to the sheer desperation behind its execution. What the script demanded, a room filled with monstrous birds assaulting the protagonists, was far beyond what 1,970 seconds effects technology could deliver convincingly. So the crew resorted to a hybrid method that felt more like a fever dream than a carefully engineered effect. Real chickens were used for certain motion plates, but they were restless and easily overwhelmed by heat from the lamps. They fluttered into corners or strutted indifferently out of frame, ignoring every cue their handlers attempted to impose. For close shots, the crew built towering foam replicas of chicken heads and claws, each one textured with rough feathers and painted to mimic the strange proportions described in the script. But these props sagged, tore, or tilted under their own bulk, especially once moisture from the humid environment softened the adhesives holding them together. Puppeteers crouched behind hay bales or beneath elevated platforms, trying to animate beaks and wings in ways that matched the jittery behavior of real birds. Sometimes the prop lunged too forcefully, startling the actors. Other times it moved with such sluggishness that performers had to exaggerate their reactions simply to sell the moment. The barn set itself amplified the chaos. Loose boards creaked unpredictably, hay scattered across the floor, making footing unstable. Lights flickered when generators wavered, casting the foam chickens in an eerie, half-strobing glow. Nothing aligned perfectly, and continuity between takes was almost impossible. Yet these very imperfections gave the scene its strange, unforgettable aura. The blend of real and artificial movement created an uncanny effect, something between natural instinct and grotesque imitation. The chickens don't look realistic, but they look wrong in a way that feels unnervingly alive. Their presence lingers not because the illusion is seamless, but because it feels like the world itself is warping around them, refusing to obey familiar rules. Fact 3. The giant wasp sequence remains one of the film's most peculiar accomplishments, not because of cutting-edge innovation, but because the team embraced an approach that bordered on absurdity. Lacking the resources for stop-motion or articulated animatronics, the crew turned to oversized printed cutouts, flat, sharpened images mounted on rigid frames. These makeshift wasps were maneuvered with rods and wires just out of frame, their stiff bodies bobbing and jittering in ways that no real insect would ever move. Yet this very stiffness created an eerie, dreamlike quality. Lighting them proved nightmarish. The glossy surfaces of the cutouts reflected even the smallest glimmer, turning the wasps into flickering blades of brightness whenever a lamp caught the angle wrong. Technicians spent hours angling lights, adjusting diffusers, and powdering the prints to reduce glare. But humidity always threatened the setup. Moisture softened the paper, causing edges to curl, while droplets formed on the surface during long takes, catching the light and betraying the illusion. Actors were tasked with reacting to these hovering shadows as if they were lethal creatures. They swung tennis rackets through empty space, relying on shouted cues from off-screen puppeteers. The timing rarely matched perfectly, leaving editors to salvage the sequence through quick cuts and strategic sound layering. The audio team built a dense soundscape of buzzing, clicking, and distorted wing beats that filled the gaps left by the limited visual realism. Despite all this, the final sequence carries an uncanny, hypnotic tension. The wasps don't resemble flesh and blood insects, they resemble hallucinations, fragments of a nightmare projected into the physical world. They're jerky. Impossible motions make the moment feel less like monster action and more like a glitch in reality itself, an intrusion of something that shouldn't exist but insists on being seen. Fact 4. The storm sequence became one of the production's most physically punishing achievements, born not from abundant resources, but from a determination to mimic chaos with whatever tools were available. The script demanded a violent, unrelenting tempest, sheets of rain, roiling winds, and sodden ground that swallowed every step. Without access to professional rain rigs or atmospheric machines, the crew built their own weather system from patchwork ingenuity. Water hoses were hoisted onto makeshift scaffolding, their nozzles adjusted by hand to produce uneven bursts of rainfall. Rusted industrial fans, borrowed from workshops around the island, sputtered and moaned as they blasted erratic gusts that shifted unpredictably across the set. The ground transformed into a treacherous swamp almost immediately. Actors struggled to keep their footing, sinking into mud that clung to their ankles like cement. Any attempt to move quickly resulted in slips, falls, or abrupt stops as the earth swallowed boots whole. Props weren't spared either. Flashlights vanished beneath the muck. Improvised wooden barriers collapsed under the weight of water-soaked soil. Even sandbags meant to stabilize lighting rigs slid across the ground when the mud liquefied, forcing crew members to scramble and reposition equipment between takes. Lighting the sequence was an ordeal in itself. Raindrops ricocheted off metal surfaces, bouncing unwanted reflections into the camera. Moisture fogged lenses, distorted shadows, and caused electrical cables to hiss ominously, prompting technicians to hover nearby with towels and makeshift insulation. Every attempt to maintain consistency was sabotaged by the storm's improvised nature. One take would appear dim and atmospheric, the next overly illuminated or streaked with lens flares caused by droplets the crew couldn't wipe away fast enough. Still, the director insisted that the actors push through the discomfort, arguing that exhaustion and frustration would give the scene an authenticity no amount of choreography could replicate. And in many ways, he was right. The trembling hands, frantic expressions, and uneven pacing weren't rehearsed. They were instinctive reactions to an environment that pushed everyone to their limits. When the storm appears on screen, it carries the weight of real struggle. It doesn't just look chaotic, it was chaotic, shaped by human persistence and the unpredictable temperament of elements the production itself unleashed. Fact 5. The miniature buildings designed to create the illusion of giant animals were delicate marvels, intricately crafted and meticulously scaled, yet inherently vulnerable to the conditions of the island. Made from lightweight balsa wood, thin foam boards, and carefully painted textures, the structures were meant to withstand only the gentle interactions required for forced perspective photography. But the environment and rats had other plans. Humidity softened the wood, warping beams and causing surfaces to bend in subtle ways that distorted the intended proportions. Roofs slumped, door frames twisted, painted siding bubbled slightly under the moisture, giving the miniatures a distorted, almost feverish appearance. Rats, always curious, transformed these fragile sets into playgrounds. They gnawed through walls, trampled shingles, and squeezed through gaps that hadn't existed minutes before. Handlers tried guiding them away with food incentives, but the animals were far more interested in exploring the tiny constructions. By midday, props that had taken hours to position were chewed apart within minutes. Every reset meant repairing cracks, gluing broken pieces, repainting surfaces, or reconstructing entire sections of the miniature world. Wind created its own havoc. Even at the lowest setting, fans toppled fences and lifted loose debris across the set. The crew weighed down roofs with hidden stones and reinforced tiny beams with steel pins, but the scale itself worked against them. Any gust strong enough to mimic atmospheric realism was also powerful enough to undo hours of careful arrangement. The cinematographer adapted by framing shots, creatively angling the camera to hide flaws, keeping certain edges of the miniature out of focus, or cutting away before structural instability became too obvious. The director, ever optimistic, argued that the distortions only made the world feel more unnerving, as though the mutation affecting the creatures extended subtly to the landscape itself. Ironically, he wasn't wrong. The warped structures gave the film an unsettling aesthetic that no digital enhancement could create. The fragility of the miniatures echoed the fragility of the story's world, a place stretched beyond its natural limits, buckling under forces it was never meant to hold. Fact 6. Macro photography, a technique intended to magnify the smallest details into overwhelming images, became both a creative triumph and a technical nightmare for the production. The idea was straightforward: use extreme close-ups of insects to make them appear grotesquely enlarged, reflecting the film's theme of unnatural growth. But macro lenses are unforgiving tools. Their depth of field is razor-thin fractions of a millimeter. The slightest movement from an insect, the table it rested on, or even the camera operator's breath was enough to throw the subject out of focus. Heat from the lighting rigs altered insect behavior dramatically. Wasps vibrated their wings in agitation, creating erratic motion blurs that were both mesmerizing and unusable. Larvae twisted and curled unpredictably, seeking cooler pockets of air beneath the lamps. Worms writhed across surfaces, beaded with condensation, leaving trails that glistened under the lights. Handlers attempted to coax more controlled movements through temperature adjustments and textured surfaces, but insects stubbornly followed their instincts rather than cinematic needs. Recording sound for these sequences was equally challenging. Macro microphones captured every minute twitch, the scrape of an insect's legs, the faint clicking of mandibles, the almost subliminal rustle of wings shifting. The raw audio was so disturbingly intimate that the sound team replaced most of it to avoid creating an unintended documentary tone. Yet traces of those original recordings remained beneath the layers, lending the scenes a subtle organic tension. Lighting required constant refinement. Too much exposure bleached out intricate textures. Too little plunged the insects into murky silhouettes. Reflections off their exoskeletons created sudden flares, requiring powders, gels, and adjusted angles to tame the shine. Still, the final results were striking. The insects didn't just appear large, they appeared impossibly present, overwhelming in their detail. Every ridge of a shell, every tremor of movement, every shimmer of moisture became amplified into something monstrous. The macro shots turned mundane creatures into alien invaders, grounding the film's horror not in fantasy, but in the unsettling clarity of magnified truth. Fact 7. The film's sound design emerged not from creative freedom, but from a series of limitations that forced the audio team into constant improvisation. With no dedicated soundstage and only rudimentary equipment at their disposal, every effect had to be crafted in environments that were impossible to control. Barns echoed strangely, hallways amplified footsteps in unpredictable ways, and outdoor locations were polluted with endless layers of wind, rustling leaves, distant machinery, and the ceaseless chorus of island wildlife. Instead of trying to eliminate these intrusions, something well beyond their budget, the sound team attempted to shape them into an uneasy backdrop. Creating the noises of oversized creatures required a mix of experimentation and luck. Technicians snapped dried sticks to mimic cracking bones, rubbed leather together to simulate scraping claws, and crushed vegetables to represent gnawing, but every sound behaved differently once recorded, gaining odd resonances from the makeshift spaces. Some came out too hollow, others too sharp, Several effects had to be spliced together, layered into unconventional mixes that felt rough but strangely fitting for a world falling apart. The real challenge came with dialogue. Outdoor scenes were nearly unusable due to wind machines and ambient noise bleeding into the recordings. ADR sessions took place in cramped rooms with inconsistent acoustics, leaving some lines faintly metallic despite countless adjustments. At times, the editor resorted to salvaging fragments from alternate takes simply because they were the only moments where the environment briefly quieted. Yet these imperfections gave the final audio an unexpected texture. Rather than clean, polished soundscapes typical of studio productions, the film breathes with a raw, uneasy rhythm, whispers of wind slipping under doors, faint tremors of movement where nothing should be stirring, and a subtle layering of environmental murmurs that makes every scene feel unstable. The world of the food of the gods seldom falls silent, and that relentless noise mirrors the film's core message. Nature never stops moving, even when humans desperately wish it would. Fact 8. Casting the film became less about choosing ideal performers and more about finding individuals who could withstand the harsh realities of the shoot. The production wasn't merely demanding, it was punishing. Prospective actors withdrew upon learning that the location involved mud-soaked terrain, unpredictable animals, and long hours, far removed from the comforts of a studio. Those who accepted brought with them a resilience that proved crucial because the island quickly revealed itself as an adversary. Marjoe Gortner carried the lead, not just with confidence, but with a strange adaptability. He pushed through scenes that required sprinting across collapsing earth or grappling with unwieldy props, never fully knowing what the set might throw at him next. Pamela Franklin approached her role with professionalism born of experience, yet she later admitted the physical and emotional toll was greater than she expected. The demands of the environment, cold dawn shoots, sudden rain, and the constant proximity to animals wore on her, blurring the line between performance and genuine fatigue. Supporting actors struggled too. Their scenes often had to be filmed out of narrative order due to transportation constraints, leaving them to assemble emotional arcs on the fly. Wardrobe complications, makeup inconsistencies, and the constant resetting of props made it difficult to maintain momentum. Some cast members found themselves performing dramatic confrontations moments after hauling equipment or helping stabilize miniature sets tasks far outside an actor's normal scope. Yet, this unintentional immersion fueled the film's authenticity. Characters appear strained, breathless, coated in dirt and frustration, not because makeup designed it, but because the environment imposed it. Their exhaustion wasn't staged, it was real. And that reality grounds the film in a way that polished performances rarely achieve. Behind the strangeness of mutated creatures and collapsing barns lies a deeper truth. The cast wasn't merely acting within chaos, they were enduring it. Fact 9. Maintaining forced perspective required an almost obsessive precision that clashed with the unpredictability of the island environment. Every trick depended on perfect alignment, miniatures positioned just so, animals placed at exact distances, and the camera locked into angles that could never waver. But the natural terrain constantly fought against these requirements. Ground shifted subtly under weight, wind rattled fragile props, even the presence of crew members walking nearby caused micro-vibrations that threw off balance. Animals were the greatest wildcard. A rat stepping forward by a few inches suddenly became absurdly oversized. Stepping back turned it diminutive. Their random movements destroyed carefully marked blocking, forcing the team to start over again and again. Combining these shots in editing created a puzzle of misaligned shadows and shifting proportions, exposing flaws that no optical trickery could fully correct. Lighting compounded the difficulty. If the background brightened even slightly, the miniature lost depth. If the foreground dimmed, the illusion broke in the opposite direction. The cinematographer manipulated bounce boards, diffusers, and gels in constant rotation, chasing an equilibrium that never held for long. Clouds rolling overhead altered the scene within seconds. Lamps heated unevenly, shifting color temperature mid-take. Camera stability became a near-religious obsession. Tripods were anchored with sandbags, and operators were forbidden from touching rigs once filming began. But even tiny tremors from the generator humming nearby or an animal brushing against a support leg spoiled takes. Despite all this, the film captures something inadvertently profound. The slight distortions, inconsistent shadows, and subtle mismatches imbue the world with an almost dreamlike instability. It feels as if reality is stretching at the seams, mirroring the film's central metaphor. Forced perspective didn't just create illusions, it exposed the fragility of a world overwhelmed by forces it was never designed to contain. Fact 10. The oversized rat paws designed for the film's close combat moments quickly evolved from simple props into unpredictable liabilities. Built from dense rubber and reinforced with internal supports, each limb was crafted to mimic the unsettling anatomy of a rodent enlarged beyond nature's limits. On paper, they were perfect for giving actors something tangible to struggle against. In practice, they were far too heavy, absorbing mud, moisture, and grit until they became unwieldy weights that puppeteers could barely control. Every swing carried a momentum that surprised even the effects crew. Puppeteers, hidden behind partial walls or crouched beneath platforms, tried to maneuver the limbs with careful precision, but the props resisted finesse. Their weight caused sudden dips or jerks, making movements look either sluggish or unexpectedly violent. Actors braced themselves for impact without fully knowing where the paw might land. Some were knocked sideways, leaving bruises that makeup had to cover. Others had costumes torn by the rough rubber edges, forcing wardrobe to scramble between takes to restore continuity. Mud made everything worse. The paws accumulated layers of wet soil that clung stubbornly to the surface, dulling the sculpted textures and adding even more weight. Effects artists wiped them down constantly, but the island environment ensured each cleaning lasted only moments before the props were filthy again. The rubber absorbed moisture too, making the limbs swell slightly and altering their feel and balance from take to take. Yet the footage captured something unexpectedly authentic. The heaviness translated into genuine force on-screen. Windows rattled convincingly, doors buckled under pressure, and actors' reactions carried a palpable tension. Their struggles weren't merely performed, they were instinctive responses to a prop that behaved like a real, unpredictable threat. The giant paws never moved gracefully, but that awkwardness became part of the illusion. They gave the impression of creatures too large for their own bodies, stumbling through violence rather than executing it with precision. In the end, the imperfections didn't break the illusion, they made it unsettlingly believable. Fact 11. The mysterious white substance driving the film's mutations might appear otherworldly on screen, but behind the scenes it was a stubborn, temperamental mixture that defied every attempt to control its behavior. The effects team concocted it from starches, dairy powders, gelatin, and water, aiming for a texture that could ooze, cling, and shimmer under lights. What they didn't anticipate was how dramatically it would react to the environment. Heat from the lamps thinned it into syrup, causing it to pool across flat surfaces. Cooler air transformed it into clumps resembling coagulated rubber. Sometimes it transitioned between both states within a single shot. Actors dreaded interacting with it. The goo adhered to fabric like second skin, drying into crusty plates that cracked whenever they moved. Wardrobe teams spent long stretches scraping residue from seams and dissolving stains that refused to disappear entirely. The mixture carried a faint sour odor when warmed, a smell that accumulated throughout the day until cast members began associating it with the most exhausting moments of the shoot. Its unpredictability caused delays as well. When used in miniature setups, the substance seeped into the tiny structures, warping delicate materials and peeling paint. When poured for close-ups, it sometimes reacted with the wood or foam beneath it, creating bubbles or strange textures that didn't match previous takes. And whenever it spilled something that happened often, the sugary components attracted swarms of insects. Ants marched in orderly lines, flies hovered persistently. During one scene, a trapped beetle writhed inside the goo, creating a moment so disturbing that several crew members stepped away from the set. Cleaning the substance off props and surfaces required near constant attention. It clogged pumps, stained floors, and left patches of tackiness wherever it touched. But despite the frustration, the goo's eerie sheen on camera gave the movie a haunting signature. Under the right lighting, it looked alive, pulsing, shifting, almost breathing. For all its inconvenience, it became one of the film's most visually convincing illusions, an unsettling presence that felt more dangerous for being so unpredictable. Fact 12. The remote island chosen for filming offered an atmosphere that couldn't be replicated artificially, but it also created a logistical gauntlet that reshaped the production from the ground up. Dense forests, narrow trails, and steep inclines turned every movement of equipment into a laborious task. Heavy generators had to be strapped to makeshift sleds and dragged over uneven terrain. Lighting kits were hauled by hand across slopes slick with moss. Even basic tools vanished into the underbrush whenever dropped, swallowed by foliage and damp soil. Rainstorms made the terrain even more unforgiving. Overnight downpours transformed footpaths into mud traps, and more than once the crew arrived to find equipment tents partially collapsed under the weight of water. Electrical gear had to be dried carefully before use, often with towels and portable heaters that strained the limited power supply. When a generator toppled during a transport run, it took hours to retrieve and stabilize, throwing the entire day's schedule into disarray. Communication suffered too. Radios fizzled as humidity seeped into their casings, leaving production assistants to relay messages the old-fashioned way, by sprinting between distant shooting sites. Injuries, twisted ankles, splinter cuts, insect stings were handled with the few medical supplies on hand, as professional help required a long trip off the island. Despite everything, the island rewarded the production with moments of uncanny beauty. Morning mist drifted through trees like a living presence. Golden hour light filtered through the canopy in shifting ribbons. The textures of wet bark, deep-shadowed ravines, and fog-draped fields created a natural atmosphere impossible to fabricate on a soundstage. Every frame captured a world that felt untouched, haunting, and quietly hostile. In the end, the island didn't merely host the film, it influenced every shot, every performance, and every technical decision. The environment became an uncredited collaborator, shaping the aesthetic through resistance and offering its own brand of cinematic truth. Beauty and hardship often spring from the same place. Fact 13. The island's proximity to the sea created a persistent, invisible adversary the crew hadn't prepared for, a fine mist of salt suspended in the air that coated everything it touched. At first, it seemed harmless, just a faint sheen collecting on metal casings and wooden structures. But within days, equipment began showing subtle signs of deterioration. Cameras developed patches of oxidation along their seams. Tripod joints stiffened as rust crept into their hinges. Even the protective filters covering lenses accumulated crystallized residue that produced faint halos around bright sources, distorting shots in ways that were nearly impossible to correct. The miniatures, painstakingly crafted for forced perspective illusions, suffered even more. Humidity softened the paint and adhesive, while salt warped the thin wooden beams until their shapes buckled. Doors refused to stay aligned. Roofs sagged in unnatural curves. The art department wiped down the sets each morning, only to find the structures subtly altered again by midday. Maintaining continuity became an uphill battle. Rubber prosthetics also reacted poorly. The salt air dried the surface, causing fine cracks that absorbed dirt and dulled the texture. Effects artists spent hours reconditioning them, using oils and pigments to restore their intended appearance. But as soon as the props returned to the open air, the degradation resumed. Worst of all, the film stock itself was vulnerable. Stored in makeshift cases, the reels absorbed moisture and expanded microscopically. The cinematographer reviewed dailies obsessively, dreading signs of emulsion, damage, grain blooming, color shifts, flicker. One reel displayed a subtle ripple effect, likely caused by humidity warping the film as it passed through the gate. An entire day of footage had to be reshot. Yet the same atmospheric conditions that tormented the crew gave the film a haunting softness. Light filtered through the salty haze, creating ethereal diffusion across exterior shots. Shadows melted gently into the environment, giving scenes a dreamlike quality. Nature imposed its character onto the film, blurring edges and infusing frames with a surreal texture that complemented the story's unraveling sense of order. What should have been a technical weakness became, unexpectedly, one of the film's defining visual signatures. Fact 14. The wardrobe team faced a constant uphill battle, not because the costumes were complex, but because the island environment waged a silent war against fabric. Clothing soaked through with rainwater became heavy and stretched, drying into new shapes that no longer matched continuity stills. Mud clung to seams, staining fabric in irregular patterns that had to be perfectly reproduced each time a scene required additional takes. Since many outfits were thrifted or altered without duplicates, recreating those stains became a daily test of memory and improvisation. Assistants photographed every rip, smudge, and discoloration, but lighting conditions shifted so dramatically across locations that colors appeared different from one reference to another. A patch of mud that looked dark brown in morning sun might appear gray under overcast skies. Reapplying these imperfections required a delicate balance. Too much, and the garment looked cartoonishly distressed. Too little, and continuity fell apart on screen. Footwear suffered even more. Boots deteriorated rapidly under harsh terrain, soles detached, leather cracked, water seeped in, leaving actors slogging through scenes with drenched feet. Wardrobe staff patched shoes, repeatedly gluing soles, stitching seams, reinforcing weak points, often moments before cameras rolled. Some repairs lasted only a few steps. Others failed mid-shot, forcing the cinematographer to adjust framing to hide inconsistencies. Then there were the unexpected disasters. During a location move, a key jacket essential for identifying a character vanished entirely. Panic spread across the crew as they searched through equipment crates, transport vehicles, and tented staging areas. It was finally discovered hanging from a tree branch near the miniature set, likely carried there accidentally during a chaotic loadout. By then, it was speckled with dirt and warped from humidity. Wardrobe artists had to recreate the exact distress pattern from earlier scenes using memory alone, so the jacket wouldn't betray the narrative timeline. Despite everything, the wardrobe's gradual degradation added an unintended realism. The characters appeared genuinely battered by their ordeal, their clothing evolving alongside their mental and physical strain. What began as a continuity nightmare became a subtle storytelling asset, the world's unraveling etched into every frayed thread. Fact 15. Animal scent trails became one of the production's most mysterious and uncontrollable problems. Each species brought onto the set, rats, chickens, dogs, even insects, left behind chemical markers invisible to humans but unmistakable to other creatures. These scents adhered to wooden surfaces, seeped into dirt floors, and lingered in crevices long after handlers attempted to clean the area. What smelled neutral to a person was, to an animal, a map of territorial warnings, curiosities, and signs of stress from the groups filmed earlier. Rats reacted most dramatically. When introduced to a miniature barn previously used by another group, some froze, noses twitching rapidly as they processed the lingering signals. Others became hyperactive, scrambling across props and chewing frantically at corners. Chickens introduced to the same sets fluttered nervously, raising their wings and pacing in restless patterns that complicated blocking. Even trained dogs used for reaction inserts grew distracted, lowering their snouts to absorb the invisible orchestra of scents embedded in the environment. Handlers experimented with countless solutions, neutralizing sprays, scented barriers, rearranged set layouts, even controlled exposure periods meant to acclimate animals before filming. None worked consistently. The island air circulated smells unpredictably, carrying traces across areas thought to be fully cleaned. Props moved between locations, unwittingly transplanted scents into fresh spaces, triggering new rounds of behavioral shifts. The atmosphere itself took on a peculiar aroma, an evolving mixture of musk, damp earth, barnyard residue, and the faint sweetness of spilled goo. Actors later recalled that certain scenes were difficult not because of physical strain, but because the smell was so thick it felt like another presence on set, shaping the mood as much as any scripted moment. Yet this unpredictability lent the animals a strange authenticity. Their movements felt primal, their reactions unrehearsed. Nothing about their behavior looked staged because nothing was. The animals weren't performing, they were responding to an invisible world layered around them. In the final film, this instinct-driven chaos deepens the sense that nature has shifted in ways humans can neither predict nor control. Fact 16. The island's magnetic abnormalities became a recurring obstacle that no one on the production fully understood. Equipment behaved as if it were under the influence of a subtle, invisible force. Cameras that ran smoothly during tests began vibrating once placed in specific clearings. Sound recorders emitted low, wavering hums without any apparent mechanical cause. Even handheld compasses spun erratically, refusing to settle on a true direction. What initially appeared to be coincidence soon solidified into a pattern that baffled electricians and technicians alike. Attempts to isolate the problem led nowhere. Crews swapped cables, repositioned generators, and even relocated entire filming setups, only to watch the same distortions reappear whenever they strayed into certain pockets of the island. In some areas, walkie-talkies cut out entirely, leaving actors stranded mid-trek without contact. Production assistants became runners by necessity, dashing across uneven terrain to deliver instructions that the radios could not transmit. Lighting rigs were among the most affected. Ballasts flickered unpredictably, sometimes strobing in a rhythmic pulse that unsettled both cast and crew. On one afternoon shoot, every lamp in a scene shut off simultaneously for several seconds before reigniting with a faint pop. The animals on set panicked instantly, rats scattered, chickens fluttered wildly, and dogs barked in agitation, ruining the take and forcing handlers to spend nearly an hour calming them. The cinematographer attempted to adapt by avoiding areas marked as unstable zones, but the island offered limited alternatives. Shots had to be re-storyboarded, scenes reblocked, and schedules rearranged repeatedly. Yet, despite the chaos, some footage captured under these conditions contained striking visual peculiarities, faint flickers, surreal shifts in shadow density, and a soft distortion that seemed to ripple subtly across the frame. Whether caused by underground minerals, atmospheric conditions, or sheer coincidence, the magnetic instability left a haunting fingerprint on the production. The film carries these anomalies like scars, small, almost spectral impressions that make its world feel slightly misaligned, as if reality itself were resisting the intrusion of cameras. Fact 17. Transportation across the island became an endurance test that rewrote the very rhythm of the production. Traditional vehicles were useless on terrain carved by roots, rocks, and deeply rutted trails. Instead, the crew relied on battered jeeps, modified carts, and low-powered tractors that crawled across the landscape with agonizing slowness. Every morning, cast and crew braced themselves not only for the day's scenes, but for the punishing journey required to reach them. Equipment suffered the worst. Camera cases thudded violently against metal floors despite layers of blankets meant to cushion them. Lenses, some of the production's most fragile assets, were carried by hand to avoid the jarring vibrations that could misalign internal glass elements. Generators bounced precariously on trailers, straining ropes and clamps with every jolt. More than once, a trailer slipped into a ditch, requiring half the crew to push, lift, or haul it free. Actors endured the same rough transit. They clung to rails or crates as the vehicles lurched, arriving on set already fatigued and coated with dust or mud. Some days, they had to walk long distances when the terrain proved too steep or narrow for even the modified vehicles. These treks drained energy before filming even began, sharpening performances with an unintentional edge of irritation and weariness. One particularly disastrous incident occurred when a cart carrying prosthetic rat limbs toppled sideways on a slope. The limbs rolled into thick mud, where they absorbed moisture and grime until they resembled decaying organic matter. Cleaning them consumed hours, and even then, their texture never fully matched earlier takes. Foot travel was no kinder. Crew members lugging light stands, sandbags, and miniature sets battled sinking mud and overgrown brush. Rain transformed the trails into slick hazards, where one misstep could send someone tumbling into thorns or swampy depressions. Yet the hardship carved something honest into the production. By the time cameras rolled, actors didn't need to pretend exhaustion. The environment delivered it naturally. Their movements, expressions, and sense of urgency carried the weight of people who had already fought their way through a hostile landscape before facing the film's fictional threats. Fact 18. Unwanted reflections became one of the production's quietest but most persistent adversaries. Tiny flashes of light that sabotaged shots and revealed the artifice behind carefully crafted illusions. Forced perspective setups relied on perfect harmony between lighting and scale, but the island's atmosphere refused to cooperate. Moisture settled on miniature surfaces, turning them into mirrors that caught and redirected stray beams. Edges of glass panels used for composite tricks glimmered unexpectedly. Even blades of wet grass near the miniatures reflected sunlight in ways that fractured the illusion. The cinematographer and lighting crew fought a daily battle against these intrusions. Flags, scrims, and matte boards transformed the set into a maze of shadows meant to swallow excess light. Surfaces were constantly dusted with powder to reduce sheen. Props were roughened with sandpaper to eliminate glossy patches. But humidity always took its toll. Coatings dissolved, matte finishes regained their shine, and metal fixtures perspired beads of moisture that caught the lamp glow. The animals contributed their own reflections. Rats' glossy fur produced faint sparkles whenever they shifted positions. Chickens' feathers glinted unpredictably, especially when damp. Even the cardboard wasps, flat, printed, and powder-treated, betrayed themselves whenever their edges caught a harsh angle of light. Every unintended highlight forced resets, new lighting calculations, and revisions to camera angles. Weather amplified the issue. Morning fog diffused light unevenly, obscuring some areas while amplifying reflections elsewhere. Afternoon sun sliced through gaps in the canopy, creating bright, shifting hotspots that moved across the set like wandering spotlights. The crew had to anticipate these changes minute by minute, often racing to capture a shot in a narrow window before the light betrayed them again. And yet, these imperfections added a strange, unreal shimmer to the final footage. The occasional glint or soft flare made the environment feel unstable, as though the mutated world of the story extended even to the light itself. The reflections, rather than revealing mistakes, hinted at a landscape subtly distorted by forces just outside human comprehension. Fact 19. Slow motion became one of the film's most intriguing visual tools, not because the technique was innovative, but because the production wrestled constantly with equipment unfit for the island's conditions. High-speed shooting demanded stable motor speeds and pristine film stock requirements that were nearly impossible to maintain amid humidity, dust, and fluctuating power from aging generators. Cameras warmed unevenly, causing the frame rate to drift by subtle increments. The result, slow motion sequences marred by faint jitter or rhythmical distortions that editors could do little to correct. To mitigate this, the crew developed a ritual before every take. Cameras were run empty to reach an internal equilibrium. Technicians wiped down sprockets, inspected rollers, and checked tension with meticulous care. But even the most rigorous routine couldn't shield the cameras from environmental interference. Dust particles found their way into the gate, scratching the emulsion with thin diagonal marks. Humidity caused the film to swell microscopically, leading to soft focus or slight warping. These imperfections, visible only during nightly screenings, often forced expensive and exhausting reshoots. Working with animals complicated matters further. Coordinating their movement with high-speed capture proved nearly impossible. Rats moved too quickly or froze altogether. Insects reacted unpredictably to the heat generated by lamps. The macro lenses used for close-ups magnified every tremor, whether from the floor, the generator's vibration, or an operator's breath, turning minutes of footage into unusable blur. Because slow-motion scenes contained no natural audio, the sound team had to build entire sequences from scratch. They layered deepened impacts, elongated scrapes, and distorted breaths to match the surreal motion. Creating weight without exaggeration became a delicate balancing act. Too heavy, and the scene veered into parody. Too light, and the tension evaporated. Ultimately, the slow-motion sequences acquired a strange beauty born from their flaws. The slight instability, the soft blurring at the edges, and the uneven flow of movement gave these scenes an uncanny resonance. The creatures didn't just seem large, they seemed caught in a different rhythm of reality, as though mutated not only in size, but in the very fabric of time. Fact 20. The film's production faced constant interference from the island's native wildlife creatures that were never intended to appear on camera, but insisted on inserting themselves into the shoot. Birds swooped across carefully framed scenes, landing boldly on miniature rooftops. Rabbits darted into shots meant to depict desolate farmland, their presence turning horror into unintentional comedy. Deer wandered through background spaces with serene indifference, pausing mid-take as if observing the chaos with quiet judgment. Nocturnal interruptions were even more disruptive. After sundown, insects were drawn to the intense heat of the lamps, swarming in spirals that made filming nearly impossible. Moths collided with lenses, their wings flashing like stray bursts of light. Frogs croaked loudly near marshy areas, overriding dialogue. Owls screamed unexpectedly during delicate emotional beats, forcing repeated attempts at capturing clean audio. One night, the production came to a standstill when a trail of raccoons raided the catering tent, scattering food containers across the set and knocking over buckets of the goo mixture. The sugary residue attracted ants by the thousands, creating a carpet of movement that had to be cleared before filming could resume. Another incident involved a fox trotting calmly into the miniature village, sniffing props before strolling away, leaving miniature fences toppled in its wake. Crew members tried every deterrent available: sound devices, scent repellents, improvised barriers, but the wildlife returned relentlessly. The island didn't operate on a shooting schedule, it followed its own rhythm, indifferent to human intrusion. Yet this unpredictable presence lent the film an intangible authenticity. The world on screen feels alive not just because of the scripted creatures, but because the environment itself refuses stillness. The sense of nature pressing in from all sides, uncontrolled, uninterested, unstoppable, mirrors the film's central fear, that once the boundaries between humanity and the wild begin to blur, control becomes an illusion. Bonus fact: Among the strangest stories whispered after production wrapped, none is more unsettling than the tale of a reel that should exist but doesn't. According to several crew members, an entire sequence was filmed early in production, a discovery scene involving a grotesquely deformed animal corpse, swollen and distorted as though the mysterious substance had reshaped its anatomy beyond recognition. The effects team spent days crafting the prop-layered latex musculature, embedded textures mimicking ruptured veins, and painted sinew that looked disturbingly organic under natural light. The scene was shot under soft afternoon haze, and those present described the result as uncomfortably real, the kind of footage that lingered in the mind long after the cameras stopped rolling. The actors' reactions were subdued, shaken in a way that felt more honest than performed. Notes recorded after the daily screening mention the director praising the moment for grounding the film's escalating absurdity in something quietly horrifying. It was meant to become a tonal anchor, an early signal that the world was slipping in ways far more disturbing than giant animals suggested. And then the reel vanished. When the team prepared to assemble the sequence days later, the canister returned from storage completely empty. Not damaged, not mislabeled, emptied. Panic swept through the production. Editors, camera assistants, and transport crew tore through every tent, crate, and vehicle, convinced it had simply been misplaced. Some believed it had been accidentally reused for new footage. Others suspected humidity had destroyed the emulsion, and someone had quietly disposed of it to avoid blame. But a few crew members offered a different theory, spoken softly. Almost jokingly, though never entirely without conviction. They believed the island itself resisted that scene, that something about the grotesque realism of the mutated corpse felt too aligned with the uncanny tension simmering around them. The same island that interfered with electronics, warped props, and unsettled animals had simply refused to let that moment remain captured. Whether carelessness or something stranger erased it, the missing reel now survives only through recollections, an unseen fragment haunting the film's legacy, a piece of its truth swallowed before the world could witness it. The Food of the Gods stands today not just as a creature feature, but as a document of a production wrestling with elements far beyond its control. Its rough edges, strange textures, and unpredictable energy are the fingerprints of a film shaped by nature as much as by human hands. If these hidden stories shifted the way you see this cult oddity, tell us which moment surprised you most. And let us know what forgotten, strange, or cursed film you want us to uncover next. Do you think the chaos behind the camera made the film stronger, or revealed a truth it was never meant to show?